So I wanted to start by asking you to describe your own scholarly journey and how it has led to the study of Bosnia, its history, people, politics, or culture. In other words, how did you get from there, wherever there was, to here with the scholarly work that you are doing now? And Amila, we can just start with you.
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you, Ben, for bringing us together. I think this is a wonderful way of launching something that hopefully in the future will be a very valuable resource for not just for Bosnians abroad and in the US, but also others who can see a positive example in Bosnia rather than a negative one. My journey is a little bit I should say it has quite a bit of curves and turns. My academic journey, in fact, began before the war. So in some ways, I am a pre-war academic in the making who then, because of the war, changed the shift, the emphasis, because, of course, of the conditions and because of the urgency, which I felt was both ethical as well as academic, to turn towards Bosnia in a way that seemed most appropriate for my academic background. I had completed my BA in Sarajevo in Arabic and English studies, and then moved on to do my MA and PhD at McGill after receiving a rather generous Aga Khan Foundation scholarship to come to Canada. And at the time, I had actually wanted to do something about the Bosnian multilingual heritage, which had been deposited in the Oriental Institute Library, but somehow had not really been addressed from a perspective of contextual literary studies or cultural studies, I would say. And ironically, there was nobody who was able to mentor me, to supervise me in Canada. And it was, I say ironically, because at the time, Bosnia was just a little speckle on the map somewhere of former Yugoslavia. People really did not know much about it. And then in the course of my studies, that situation tremendously changed. The war broke out in Yugoslavia and then specifically in Bosnia, and all eyes were turned towards Bosnia, but in a very negative way, as a very negative example of what was going on and how people hated each other and ethnic violence and all this, so on and so forth. Whereas in fact, in the background of my academic career, there was this, there was something else. There was this heritage which testified to a very integrated cultural fabric. In other words, culture that was not about people coexisting, but people really living together and participating in each other's cultural sensibilities, writing in multiple languages in ways that obviously had an audience. And I wanted to, the thing that I had actually wanted to do in the first place, which had not been known, suddenly became a point of attention for me. And in the course of after I finished my PhD, I thankfully found a place at my university now, which allowed me to shift from what I was doing formally in my PhD to turn towards Bosnia and in fact dig out that cultural heritage, which by then had already been in danger because the Oriental Institute, where most of the manuscripts that I had wanted to work on, had been burned down, and of course many of the other things, testimonies to cultural diversity of Bosnia in pre-modern times, were targeted for destruction. Ottoman heritage specifically that I was interested in. So it seemed to me that it was absolutely necessary for me as a Bosnian, as a citizen of the world, as somebody who had a cosmopolitan kind of outlook on life, to in fact engage and in whatever was left and talk about it, write about it, not only as some kind of utopian nostalgia, but as a way of saying, this is the world that everybody has to preserve. I mean, we all need to look up to, and as it shows now, it is really a necessity, which is a global necessity now, to talk about cultural pluralism and religious pluralism in a world in which these sharp divisions are being drawn along very artificial lines.
Thank you. We'll return to a lot of those topics, I'm sure, as the conversation unfolds. Yeah. Dženeta.
Thank you. I kind of just want to keep listening to Amila speak and talk about her research, but I'll share a little bit about my own scholarly journey. Before that, I want to again thank you, Ben, for bringing us together. As you can tell, I'm already enjoying this. To speak a little bit about my journey, it started also relatively from a windy path in the sense that I, due to the war, grew up in Germany as a refugee, and my family ended up moving to the United States in the late 90s. Speed up to the point of me studying during my undergraduate degree, I anticipated and sort of felt like I should be living, I wanted an academic career, but at the time the focus was German literature, actually. Having grown up as a refugee and sort of in Germany and wanting to preserve speaking German and whatnot, and generally sort of being very interested in literature. And so at the University of Vermont, I double majored in German and political science with a minor in Holocaust studies. And this is where I sort of first came to terms or saw this definition of what a diaspora is and what that looks like, particularly within the context of Holocaust studies, and started to sort of wonder a little bit about why there wasn't a discussion happening about a Bosnian diaspora at the time. And this is now over a decade, 15 years ago. And that sort of led me to, at the master's level and at the graduate level, to defer from the German literature path more towards this path of migration studies and diaspora studies, looking particularly in a peace and conflict literature, and sort of taking an interest in how potentially we could start thinking about and do research on Bosnians living abroad, Bosnians living elsewhere, Bosnians living in diaspora. And so over the last, and this continued throughout my PhD and in my career since, I've been very much focused on these non-state actors, so beyond states, whether it's a diaspora, whether it's a civil society actor, whether it's a social movement, and the general interplay of these institutions and different actors within, relatively messy settings. And by that, I mean transitional settings. By that, I mean transnational settings. And so Bosnia and Herzegovina offers sort of the perfect case in many ways for this, and a case that I think can inform in a lot of other cases, and one that I think is very ripe and sort of has variance within the case as well. I come from a social science perspective, so I think about it in that way. And so for me, what's led me to sort of study this and to continue to be fascinated with it, topics regarding Bosnia, have been in part both these sort of historical and the impact of it on Bosnian society, and more generally migration studies, diaspora studies, transitional justice literature, but also I think increasingly how much we see that really Bosnia and Herzegovina in many ways is a microcosm of what's happening on the global scene, and the potential that we can sort of, and the lessons that we can draw from what's happening or what has happened in Bosnia, or what might, potentially happen in the future in Bosnia. And so those are some of the sort of questions that I grapple with in relation to Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you. Adna?
Well, I just want to echo Amila and Dženeta as well, and thank you, Ben, for organizing this. I certainly hope that Bosnian studies is a growing field, and I think we are seeing so many different manifestations of it, and that's a really positive thing, I think. The entry point for me into the study of Bosnia really didn't begin in a scholarly sense. It rather came through advocacy, and frankly, it came about because of the war. I was a teenager when the war began. And so, you know, growing up, it was a huge influence on me. Already, you know, I was already living in diaspora before the war with my family. And so, you know, watching everything unfold from outside of the country and seeing sort of the family being impacted by it obviously had a huge impact on me as growing up. But in terms of the scholarly work, like I said, it came through advocacy. And I had finished my master's studies in international affairs. I moved to Washington, DC, and this was right around 2003, 2004, when all the discussions about constitutional reform and sort of what to do about Dayton were happening in Bosnia. And I was working in the policy field in Washington, so I was familiar sort of about all the different you know, structures and organizations and advocacy lobbying that was happening on Bosnia. The US government was, of course, quite involved in the constitutional reform process. So within the Bosnian diaspora in the United States, there was an effort to try and influence these processes, to influence the State Department and members of Congress in a certain direction in terms of where the negotiations would go and what the ultimate outcome would look like. And I became involved with a group of younger Bosnians or Bosnian Americans who were working on this. What was driving really the activism and the mission of this group was the diaspora community and its experience, you know, with displacement and resettlement. We had excellent contacts with communities in St. Louis, but also, you know, in many different parts of the US, Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, and so on. And these were communities, as we know, that had ended up there because they had been ethnically cleansed. So our role as the Advisory Council for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which you mentioned in the introduction, and I was a member of the board of that organization, our role was to be their voice, to push for a constitutional reform that would provide justice for those whose families had been killed and who had been displaced. And it was really through meeting and talking to these, you know, fellow members of the diaspora community, getting to know them, hearing their stories, that I started thinking about switching gears from advocacy towards academia, to doing, you know, a more rigorous and in-depth study of the effects of the war and displacement on the diaspora. I'm not sure, honestly, if it had not been for the war, if I would have gone towards academia, but this was, you know, it was led by that experience and by those relationships with members of the diaspora. And I was lucky also to have met during this time in Washington, Dr. Jared Toll at Virginia Tech, who also had a very deep interest in questions of displacement. And he sort of nurtured that interest, encouraged me to pursue the scholarly direction. So I eventually joined the academic program he was leading at Virginia Tech and made the diaspora and the effects of displacement the focus of my dissertation.
Thank you. David. David, there you go, yeah.
Sorry for the delay in unmuting. Well, thanks again, Ben, for inviting me to participate and inviting all of us. And thanks to you for your extraordinary work at Fontbonne University in the Bosnia Memory Project. And again, I was very interested to hear the other stories of the beginnings. I was thinking of Dženeta. Dženeta's interest in German literature, and because I was remembering this book by Claudio Magris on the Danube, in which he explains that the Danube has these official, you know, different beginning points. There's one in Donaueschingen and one in Furtwangen. They both have signs saying this is where the Danube begins. And I think that's like my answer to this question. We'll probably have different beginnings. That where the streams were going to join the river. And I guess the one beginning that I was thinking about was the time I was in Paris when the bombing of Kosovo began. It was the NATO bombing campaign in March '99, and at the time, I remember we were all very concerned that the negotiating team at the Rambouillet peace talks had been killed. We thought Ibrahim Rugova, for example, and his team had already been killed. There was a great deal of concern, and I remember thinking, you know, I really wanted to understand what was happening. You know, I try to take my intellectual impoverishment as a motivation, and so this was a very important moment to think about the function of Kosovo in this story, and the ultimate, thinking about the appropriation of Kosovo by Milosevic in 1989, that brought the Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia to declare independence. So I somehow remember vividly this moment in Paris with when the NATO bombing began. The other beginning, I would say, is for a lot of academics, it would be like that. I would be working with my students on research projects. The students would be studying in a class that was devoted roughly to different instances of catastrophic violence resulting from human rights violations. Some of the students wanted to study Bosnia, and together we were discovering research literature, and something that I call, witness literature, accounts written by journalists, by humanitarian aid workers, or by people working on exhumations. And so working with the students, I found a kind of an interest in the capacity of the witness literature to tell the truth about what happened, or even to be a kind of rhetorical restoration of the world that the perpetrators tried to erase. So I wrote something about that. The title of this article seems completely unrelated to Bosnia, but it was called "The Task of Justice," and it was about the task these witness accounts perform. So that was called no subtitle, "The Task of Justice," and so that was one entry point. And the last thing I thought about was when I went to Sarajevo to present this paper that I was just talking about. I arranged, it's just historical coincidence, with one of the conference organizers, Haris Halilovic, for his cousin Omer to take me to Srebrenica, because that particular conference wasn't going to Srebrenica, so I arranged to go with Omer. And sometimes I feel like I learned everything I know in its fundamental nascent stages from that 7 or 8 hours in the car that day with Omer driving to Srebrenica, and arriving in the Potocari Memorial Cemetery, and a kind of unforgettable moment, and then visiting Srebrenica, which was still the mosque in the center of town had not yet been rebuilt. Motel Alic had not yet been restored, so it was still in the developing stages. But for example, when we stopped at the Nova Kasaba soccer field, where I wanted to take photographs for my class, we were confronted by a carload of Bosnian Serbs, and I was sort of learning quickly about the controversial nature, about the nature of genocide denial. And this motivated me to try to dig deeper and understand, and try to tell the truth about the genocide.
Thank you. One of the things that we're interested in getting at in this panel is a better grasp on the relationship between scholarship and justice. And here's my next question, which might elicit some answers that overlap with what you've already said, but so be it. Has your scholarship, or how has your scholarship responded to the questions of human rights and civil rights that persist in Bosnia? And we don't have to go in any particular order. Whoever feels moved to respond to that question, please do.
Maybe I will offer a first attempt at a response. I mean, I think for me, studying the Bosnian diaspora is, you know, most certainly also reckoning with, you know, the severe human and civil rights abuses that occurred during the conflict, but that also continue to manifest themselves in present day society and politics of Bosnia. And maybe I will just mention two things. First, and I think most importantly, we have the question of genocide, rape, and other war crimes that were committed during the conflict. And these are not, they're not questions of the past. They're very much questions of the present for the survivors. This is visible in the precision with which they remember details, which remains astounding to me when I do oral histories with members of the diaspora. But what makes the injustice and the inhumanity they suffered even worse is the denial about these crimes and how it continues to persist. And as it goes unpunished, as long as it remains uncriminalized as a discourse, it feeds even more efforts at genocide denial that only become more outrageous with time. We see, of course, the war criminals being glorified. We see places and streets being named after them. We see survivors groups being denied the ability to properly commemorate the loss of their loved ones and being attacked when they attempt to. And so these are ongoing injustices born out of the catastrophe, the human rights catastrophe of the 1990s. But related to that, I mean, I would mention that having Dayton become the long-term governing structure for Bosnian society and politics, which it was not set up to do, has ingrained human rights and civil rights problems into Bosnian politics and society. It has enabled ongoing injustice by freezing in place the politics that fueled the war, and by partitioning Bosnia along those ethnic lines. The consequences are complete dysfunction politically that feeds societal dysfunction, inertia, despair, especially among the younger population. And it's hard obviously for a younger population to see any prospect in such a country, and in a country whose constitution itself is discriminatory to those outside of the three principal groups. And you know, this is something that all the three leading nationalist parties can agree on, that allows them to keep the country in a chokehold and not to change a thing. So I see Dayton as a perpetuation of that, a self-serving perpetuation of the injustice that began in the 1990s.
I'll add, I think when you say sort of how my scholarship has responded or how our scholarship has responded, I think it's a tall order to sort of say that scholarship has that kind of impact, but I hope with my scholarship to sort of focus on the variety of narratives. I mean, Adna mentioned the sort of narratives about genocide denial, but in my research, when I look at sort of diaspora mobilization and mobilization in general, right, I think there's multiple other narratives that also come to mind. There's the narratives that, you know, people in Bosnia tell themselves today in terms of survival, in terms of how the state is functioning or not functioning, right? Why they are staying, why they are leaving, right? But there's also moreover the narratives that the ethno-national political parties that really sort of are embedded within that system tell people, right? And the stories that they tell in order to, there's a local elections coming up, or these sorts of things. And I think for me, what I try to do in my research and in my scholarship is to really respond to those narratives, to come to sort of, take them apart a little bit, and to really sort of put a mirror to them in terms of injustice, in terms of, the effect that they have long term on that society, but also in terms of how that society looks at the past. And beyond that, I think also how others see it. Because in many ways, the things that limit Bosnian society are also, I think, ways that you could see potential opportunities. I mean, this is a country that has survived genocide. This is a country that has survived, the worst atrocity in Europe since World War II. This is a country that, for all the horrible things that you can say about its dysfunction in terms of the Dayton framework, has remained peaceful over 25 years this year. So I do think that there's also potential for narratives for, Bosnian society, for Bosnian politicians to sort of shift those narratives in terms of, what can we learn? How can this be functional? How can we be a country that is known for, genocide prevention? How can we be a country that is known for commemoration, that, has, is respectful to victims, is respectful to survivors, brings in a different narrative, one that's not necessarily simply a victimhood, but also one of survival, one of agency, right? One where it's not just always this passive object, whether that object is the Bosnian state, or whether that object is the Bosnian people, or whether that object is, individuals, or particular localities. So those are some of the things that I hope to sort of touch on and poke a little bit with my scholarship.
I'm happy to add a couple of words as well to these two very articulate answers on the topic. Because my scholarship is related to primarily pre-modern history, I find it direct relationship with the issues of human rights and political issues is not direct, but nevertheless, we do know that scholarship is often used and abused for political purposes, and therefore one needs to be cognizant of the fact that knowledge is not a straightforward and finished product. It's always in the process of being told and retold. And this issue of narratives is, I think, where we, where in some ways also my scholarship or my eye has turned towards. In other words, how do we talk about a long durée of history from my perspective, how do we talk about Bosnian history by recognizing the push and pull of both the sort of productive and creative moments in history, as well as these violent ones? In what way do they relate to each other? And what are the specific moments in history that have generated either of the two or something in between? And especially now, of course, given that we are talking about a very fresh still memory of, we are still the first generation in some ways of people who remember what happened on the ground. Some of us have been directly there involved. Some of us have looked from the sidelines, but nevertheless, we are in a moment in which we can see how easy it is to turn memory, to turn trauma, how easy it is to make divisions there where in fact naturally they don't happen, and how in fact creation of narratives, particularly in the so-called collective memory, in the so-called cultural memory, these steering of the narratives can create more damage than in fact was done even on the ground. And I think for all of us who are observing Bosnia from an academic perspective, this is a moment in which we realize how much Bosnia needs to be brought into the global conversations about such matters from a deeply interdisciplinary perspective, whereby the commitment to not just a frozen kind of pluralism that Bosnia may have had in the past, but a kind of dynamic pluralism. After all, you know, diversity is something that always changes. It changes in time, and the things that we talk about now as diversity, which includes diversity of you know, gender issues, identifications along those lines, questions of minority rights and so on and so forth, which had been in the past somehow buried under more grand narratives, how they need to be given space in our scholarship and need to be given attention, but without, in some ways, without again, putting them in some kind of hierarchical sense, but trying to understand how we can in fact speak of diversity that now exists in Bosnia without falling into the traps of ethno-national forms of diversity, of these hierarchized forms of diversity. In other words, find language that speaks across disciplines and across different forms of discourse, in which that question of diversity that is a historical reality of Bosnia, regardless of what, you know, it's a cumulative reality of Bosnia, in fact, needs to be, needs to go forward rather than, in fact, to be frozen in time.
If we have a moment, I would say a word about that question.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for these comments. I liked also Jennifer's comment about, you know, questioning the relation of research and scholarship to activism. It's an interesting reflection. I guess what I found happening was that I would be trying to understand the genocide, and because I think it's important to try to understand causes of genocide so that we can work to prevent genocide and especially prevent a recurrence of the violence. And I was probably through historical accident, I was accompanied the exhumation team to Visegrad in 2010, and there was work going on in the dam, I think Bajina Basta Dam by Lake Karabegović, and so the river level had dropped, and so the people in the Missing Persons Institute and the ICMP realized they would be able to locate some of the victims of the murders on the bridge in 1992. People who'd been murdered on the bridge and thrown into the river. So I wound up with a team. I see Velma Saric was with me, and so I was witnessing the location and the exhumation of the human remains. And this was important to be able to bear witness to what was happening so that I could write about that in lectures and also in public lectures and in my classes. But the point I was trying to reach was that at some point, so this was 2010, at some point in 2012, the survivors and activists buried the victims whose remains had been identified in the private Muslim cemetery in Visegrad. And the town said they were going to destroy the memorial. So they asked me if I would write a letter to the High Representative about that. So I thought that was, I was playing a role as an academic in writing the letter. I wrote the letter on university letterhead and provided an analysis that the destruction of the memorial, amounted to the fact that Republika Srpska was an apartheid entity because there's a memorial in the middle of town in celebrating the perpetrators, but they weren't allowed to have this memorial in the Stražište cemetery. So that was, let's say, that's how I became involved as an academic in what was a human rights issue from my point of view, to allow for memorialization, which it seems is protected by numerous international human rights documents, and that process led to other issues, because they also wanted to destroy the town wanted to destroy the Piranishka Street house, allegedly as part of a road widening scheme. So that the property was condemned and appropriated by the town. So so I was asked to write an open letter to, I think I wrote to Samantha Power, who was at the time U.S. ambassador to the UN, to try to. So so in a way, I've been working with people in Bosnia, with survivors, trying to address human rights issues and doing the best I can to support them and galvanize, raise awareness about the atrocities and the human rights violations.
Thank you. I'd like to take things in a slightly different direction, and it has to do with the relationship of the diaspora and diaspora scholars to the presence of an interest in Bosnia really around the globe now. All of you, of course, have multinational backgrounds or have worked multinationally. And one of the things that it seems to me to be the case is that precisely because of the fact that so many people 25 to 30 years ago were expelled from Bosnia-Herzegovina, there has been a kind of seeding around the world of an interest because of the presence of people from Bosnia. And another factor that plays into that is that now 25 years since the end of the armed hostilities, we see a younger generation of people coming of age and grappling with those questions of legacy and identity that come about because of forced displacement. And so my question is, can you say anything about the relationship between the presence of the diaspora in the world, including the academic world, and the growing body of scholarship about Bosnia?
I mean, I can start on this question. I think before I delve into it, it's probably also important to acknowledge that there are also excellent scholars in Bosnia who are doing, solid work, and the field of Bosnian studies, I think, in many ways, builds on some of that scholarship. When it comes to diaspora scholars, I mean, by virtue of the displacement that happened as a result of the forced migration and war, really, during the 1990s, as you sort of mentioned, there has been at least one, if not two, generations of scholars coming of age, if you will, in an academic sense. And so when we think of it in sort of social science or humanities terms, it makes sense for somebody with linguistic abilities, with interest, with sort of grappling with identity issues or legacy issues, to also work on this region and to sort of from a personal perspective. But I think beyond that, to also really what I enjoy about diaspora scholars and the research that they're doing in raising awareness about Bosnia is that in many ways, because they are publishing in English language sources rather than scholars in Bosnia proper, and because they are trained in a sort of, if you will, Western way, right, embedded in larger literatures and speaking to those and connecting the Bosnian cases to that. There is, I think we've seen sort of an explosion of the Bosnian case being used for a variety of beyond sort of the classic cases. And so I think there you see real potential from diaspora scholars in connecting and connecting both the local scholarship as well as sort of scholarship abroad. What I worry, and I think, there are also Bosnian diaspora scholars in the sciences working, that don't necessarily focus on what we would call Bosnian studies, but that are very much present in academic discourses and policy work, etc. So there is sort of a burgeoning field of, the things that Adna and I focus on, diaspora as a concept, as a population, as sort of this multi-ethnic, diverse population that has, many sort of much potential in terms of both scholarship and etc. But I think what I also want to say in terms of contribution to sort of a growing body of scholarship is that one of the things that I worry about, and what I've been trying to work on in the last 5 years or so, is also making sure that there is a knowledge transfer happening, that there is some of this knowledge going back to Bosnia, whether it's helping young scholars in Bosnia establish themselves in a field, or sort of gain methodological skills, or translate some of the things that we work on into local languages, and also really collaborating with educational institutions that oftentimes don't necessarily have the resources that those of us working in academia outside of the country have access to. So for me, in many ways, as a diaspora scholar who focuses on these are also some of the things that I focus on when I think about growing bodies of scholarship, including obviously, also politics of citation, and making sure that you're, not ignoring this field that exists within the country, and scholars that were working on these topics there as well.
Thank you.
May I add something very quickly to that, Ben? Because I think Dženeta's answer was really excellent. But I would maybe just add one thing. Both of us, I think, also Dženeta and I, as being interested in diaspora, we also have that more direct experience of growing up in Bosnia, remembering that. What I worry about is then that knowledge transfer to the second generation of young Bosnians who weren't born in Bosnia, and who will take that study forward. How will Bosnian studies be continued? And when Dženeta was talking about sort of the knowledge transfer, I think it also applies to Bosnian Americans or Bosnian Germans, or whatever combination it is, having that exposure to Bosnia and facilitating some kind of educational exchange where they can visit Bosnia and have that more sort of direct experience of their culture and history, which creates, and I would hope creates, the foundations of pursuing scholarship and carrying on this study.
I really am very much enjoying these answers, and I think it's for us also, it's a platform for learning at this point. And we are in many ways paving the new road. I mean, we don't really know. We can take examples or try to emulate other people's experiences, other cultural groups that have strong connections between diaspora and home culture, and they have a strong established academia and so on and so forth. But I think it is really highly important for us to precisely nurture those links between Bosnia and the rest of the world, where we all are scattered, and where we are all really very well represented, and represented in intellectually powerful ways. I mean, I'm always very proud of students who come from Bosnia and from the region in general, from former Yugoslavia, and always find that they are motivated in ways that many other students are not. So I think that there is a potential, there is a fantastic potential in the diaspora to bring up and bring out possibilities of interpretation that are internationally, that are born out of these differences of location, differences of disciplinary orientation, and so on and so forth. And also to keep reminding ourselves that Bosnia is one big primary resource for so many scholars across disciplines, and people go to Bosnia to, in fact, find themselves academically speaking. I mean, they come up with ideas when they visit Bosnia. So in that sense, it is not just about Bosnian diaspora, it's about this international almost army of scholars, young scholars, as well as scholars of already established statures, who in fact find in Bosnia great inspiration for a variety of disciplinary perspectives on the human condition, on political issues, on historical issues, geological issues, biological issues, and so on and so forth. So I do think that Bosnian, that we must bring out that kind of international connectivity component, that Bosnian studies can only be meaningful in context of an international body of scholarship with an international outlook, so that we don't further close in as the situation on the ground demands. I mean, these ethno-national divisions in Bosnia that follow the Dayton agreement have left tremendous scar on the way in which people speak about each other, and it really has brought out the worst kind of narcissism of small differences, alas, and that translates into the way in which scholars are treated, in which scholarship has become very partisan in many ways. And so it's with this diaspora help, as well as the help of non-diaspora scholars who are interested in Bosnia, that I think those artificial lines that separate scholarship there can be constantly attacked and broken broken apart, so that the connections can be enhanced rather than pushed under the covers.
Mm-hmm. David, anything to add?
Well, I would just say that Bosnians, people in Bosnia are doing so much important work, and also Bosnians in the diaspora are doing so much important work. I learned so much from reading, interacting with people, and I feel like that the people have, especially young people, have kept their hearts open to the hope that telling the truth about the genocide will lead to justice. And somehow I've just had the honor to become part of that process as an ally in the process. And I could give so many examples. I remember participating in a panel in 2007 in Sarajevo with Yasmina Bashirovic Reagan, who's at Yale, but I didn't know Yasmina, but her presentation completely shaped the direction of my research, and also the documentary film I was making with my son at the time. So that's just one example. I read an op-ed piece by Emir Suljagic yesterday about Dayton, and it was just full of important information that everybody should know. Mm-hmm. So, well, the future is bright. I feel like people are motivated because they're trying to fight silence and denial. So that's a motivating factor, and I think as I said, I think the future is bright. The work is hard.
Well, that's the perfect segue into my next questions, which are, I'm just going to combine a couple of questions and ask you what avenues for additional research and scholarship should be pursued in the future, including by yourselves, and what is the value of that continued production of scholarship about Bosnia in the coming years?
Maybe I will try to outline a little bit of what I would like to do with the Center for Bosnian Studies going forward. I think definitely going back to what I was saying about the younger generation and retaining, trying to retain those connections for a future for Bosnian studies is also sort of working with this younger generation and understanding how their ties to Bosnia are developed and maintained. It's still, very much, I think that that generation is an unknown factor. You know, how their parents and grandparents' experiences are influencing their own identity. What are the conditions under which they are motivated to retain those connections? How do they do that? And that is something I think through oral histories, but also these awareness events that we do with the Center for Bosnian Studies, trying to bring in that population is, at least for me, will be an important area of study. But also I think it's important to continue doing that work of oral histories, of collecting and establishing that record of experience with the diaspora community, because you know, as we see with the experiences of the Holocaust and the excellent sort of record keeping that has been done about that, it's allowed a whole new generation to be able to define you know, their personal history, to understand their personal history, something that they can trace their own identity to. And I think we have to make that possible for the relatives of the generation that were part of the conflict, because I really truly believe that they'll be looking to that history one day, as well as a source of their own identity, something to trace it to. So, you know, those are sort of the younger generation, but also continuing that record keeping and creating the story for the future is something that I will be striving to do.
Happy to add on to that. Again, going to, of course, personalizing it in my own research, I recently came across one quotation that I had long scribbled down somewhere when I was reading the great Bosnian chronicler and diarist and writer Mula Mustafa Bašeskija of the 18th century, in which he says, "Acayip ahval Bosna vilayetinde böyle olduğu yoktudur," which means there are such strange things happening in Bosnia. Never before had anything happened like this. So in other words, already in the 18th century, we have something that we can easily quote right now in the 21st century. And rather than, you know, going into this proverbial that history is the, you know, the teacher of life, it's rather that history is something that in its sort of articulated sense has both the value of course, making us turn back to something to learn about ourselves, but also can be victim of different processes of history, different historiographical processes. And what I find now that has happened and that is happening, alas, is that we are in some ways disconnected from our own history, particularly our pre-modern history. We are, as Bosnians, already rewriting history from a very divisive point of view. And I think this is something that needs to be very urgently corrected, that we need to reconnect with that history. And by what I mean by that is that we do know that, you know, Bosnia has a very complicated and very complex history. It's a history that involves, from the academic point of view, it involves different disciplines: Slavic studies, European studies, Ottoman studies, and so on and so forth. And these disciplines usually don't talk to each other. And they have started speaking, opening up to each other only in the recent decade. And I think Bosnia, it's an extremely urgent situation that Bosnia enters that conversation, because it is a place in which not only different cultures have met, but also different disciplines have met. And they need to be connected in order to actually present a more holistic, more real, integrated, organic history of Bosnia and cultural history of Bosnia. And this, at some level, is my vision of my own scholarship as being able to in fact bring up those connections where they have actually been disconnected, whether academically or whether politically, whether ideologically or whether simply through cultural memory, that we, in cultural memory, which of course is a neat narrative of what we should remember, we also leave out many things. And also those things that we leave out are also part of our cultural fabric. So it's really an attempt to see Bosnia in this regionally and globally important sense of offering, of giving us a way of understanding the present in a much more cumulative sense, in a much more holistic sense than in fact institutionally has been allowed for.
Mm-hmm. David?
I got lost in that beautiful answer. So I would say that in terms of continued research and so forth, I think it's important for people to connect with the work that Fontbonne University is doing. Also remembering Srebrenica, UK, Srebrenica Memorial Center, Bosnian American Genocide Institute and Education Center, all these groups that are networking and providing resources for further work. I think in my own work, I'm trying to continue to focus on the importance of the rule of law in Bosnia and doing more research on a framework for a law against genocide denial in Bosnia, a law against the glorification of war criminals. I found it very I was very fortunate to discover a whole literature in the EU, because they have a directive that all member states shall have laws against genocide denial, and so there's a culture of jurisprudence that Bosnia could build on, and in fact there are already amendments to the criminal code in Bosnia that could be adopted. So I had conversations with the High Representative last year at about this same time. And so I've been trying to advocate for that. I was encouraged to a certain extent when at the UN Security Council address recently, he said that he was asking for President Dodik to take down the plaque on the student dormitory in Pala, and if he didn't take it down, there would be some sanction applied, perhaps restricting Dodik's travel to the EU. So I thought that was symbolically, you could say better than nothing. But I also discovered, which is material for further research, as you know, that survivors from Omarska are prohibited from installing their own memorial, so they're forced to go and hold ceremonies on August 6th every year. So I think these are human rights violations that need to be addressed. When I was there last, August 2019, I discovered these monumental sculptures by Miodrag Živković, which are in Bijeljina, in Prijedor, in Brčko, and they're all glorifying the so-called Serbian fighters or defenders of Republika Srpska. In Brčko, the inscription is, that's devoted to the defenders of Brčko, Serb defenders of Brčko. So there's this glorification, this one could say a revisionism, glorification that amounts to denial of really colonizing the cultural landscape in the service of denial. So I feel like the plaque to Ratko Mladić on Vratsa Hill, but to Radovan Karadzic on, they sort of pale by comparison to these massive monuments. So this is some new research I'm working on.
Thank you. Dženeta?
I think there's many avenues and of research and exploration in terms of Bosnian studies, and just to sort of echo some of the thoughts that Amila, David, and Adna have been speaking about. I think for me, and I think to some degree I try to do this in my own work. I don't know how much I always succeed, but I think on one hand, there's an importance, there's really an importance of doing comparative work. And by comparative work, I don't mean just sort of the comparative work in the sense of, looking at, say, comparing the case of Bosnia with the case of Rwanda in terms of genocide or in terms of memorialization or commemoration, just to give an example, but also in terms of regional comparisons, whether we're talking about European integration or whether we're talking about, legacies of the past. But I think beyond that, also this sort of question of multi-level governance in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's a lot of comparative potential, looking at comparing localities within Bosnia and Herzegovina. David mentioned Srebrenica and Prijedor. There are these, there's many beyond this, right? You could be looking at, Banja Luka versus Sarajevo, or not necessarily versus, but sort of comparing these cases within Bosnia and Herzegovina and really seeing how particular localities are working, and responding to a variety of challenges and whatever sort of each discipline is concerned with. I think beyond that also, I think there's a real potential to look at organizational perspectives and to really look at, some of the work that institutions have been doing in Bosnia and Herzegovina, whether these are international institutions, David mentioned the OHR, or whether they're, World Bank, the various UN institutions, in most recent terms, IOM in when we speak about migration within the country, right? The sort of migrant route that Bosnia finds itself on, unwillingly, right? In many ways, I think is really interesting. And I think there's real need for critical engagement with the work that is being done and the collaborations that are existing between international institutions or local institutions and either the state or a variety of non-state actors, both in terms of actual programs, but also in terms of norm setting and the translation of those norms into a variety of local settings. I really liked what Adna said about the second generation of Bosnian / scholars, Bosnian American, German, Canadian, whatever you will. And I think it really ties also into many ways what Amila was talking about, cultural heritage and history. There are whole chunks of history that, many individuals, including those in Bosnia, including those in the diaspora, are just simply unaware of because they've been erased from our collective memory, if you will, willingly or unwillingly. And I think there's real gaps in that knowledge that I think have real potential to be researched further, whether it's, the more recent past, sort of the post-socialist legacies in Yugoslavia. I was part of a collaborative effort over the summer, Yugosplaining the World, I think it was called, that brought together fantastic scholars that sort of looked at these things, but then also sort of the more historical things. There's, Bosnian kingdom questions, right? The Middle Ages, these sorts of things. But I think also more sort of moving now into the future and the potential of looking at, more recent literature studies. I mean, Amila mentioned one of our sort of big important authors that we all read, but more recently we have, the work of Aleksandar Hemon, Sasha Stanisic, Lana Bastasic, Martina Mlinarević. I mean, there's many sort of more recent Bosnian literature that has been both grappling with issues within Bosnian society, but also more broadly. Selvedina Avdić, how could I forget one of my favorite books, right? And I think there's real potential to contextualize that literature and to examine that literature, both, the literature being written by individuals outside of Bosnia, as well as those within the country, and how they sort of reflect on the society, to move beyond, right, just the usual ethno-national political elites that are very much taking, co-opting the situation and taking advantage of it. I mean, I could go on forever, but I think there's two sort of other short points that I want to make. One of them being the need for more data. Those of us on this panel focus more on qualitative work, focus more on field research, focus more on archival things. But I think there's, you know, within the country and when there's scholarship on the country, there's a lot of projections, there's a lot of sort of internalization of what we think might be happening. But I think, as Adna said, there is really a dearth of, we don't know many things. And I think there is an importance of really examining data, whether it's doing surveys, whether it's sort of, you know, really bringing the potential for, you know, statistical research or you know, working with data that is bigger in order to be able to draw some larger conclusions. And then touching on many of the things that David was saying, you know, this question of participation research, right? Of really bringing in individuals on the local level to see how they see the situation, really sort of thinking about it in terms of this knowledge cultivation. What can we learn from individuals on the ground? You know, Bosnia, as Amila has said, has been this country where academics go to find themselves for the last, you know, 3 decades or so, 2 decades, if you will. And, you know, you have individuals in Srebrenica who have been interviewed by hundreds of scholars, right? And I think it would be really interesting, both in the context of Bosnian studies, to examine, you know, what are their perspectives on this? You know, at some point when you've spoken to, you know, 12 American PhD students who all ask you the same question, maybe you have perhaps a better perspective than the variety of others who are publishing on this and, you know, building their careers out of this. And so I think the work that David does, really sort of participation research, working with survivors, bringing their voices to the forefront, I think has real potential when we speak about Bosnian studies. That sort of collaborative work on the local level, as well as sort of further, if we sort of bring it out from the academic level, collaboration, training of young scholars, working with scholars there on larger projects. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I'll stop.
I wish we had time for you to go on, because I think what you're saying is fascinating and really, really to the point. We're about at the end of our time, and I wanted, before we close out, to ask if there's anything that we haven't covered that really needs to be mentioned today, by way of response to something somebody said, or just by way of covering something that my questions didn't quite get at. Any last words people want to have here?
I guess Dženeta reminded me of the work I was doing with Isak Gashi, who was a survivor of Luka concentration camp in Brčko. And I think that we should remember what happened in Brčko. But so he survived, and then he became a witness at The Hague. And we were in Brčko last August, and we went to the site of the concentration camp. And what is important for researchers to know is that since Brčko is not in Republika Srpska, they do have a memorial. They're allowed to have a memorial. So the space there's a memorial space with photographs and a record of what happened, not only in Brčko, but also in other places in Bosnia. So where there might not be a memorial in Omarska, there is a memorial about Omarska in Brčko. So it's an important, it provides some important insight into the possibilities for memorialization.
Well, if there are no other comments, then I want to thank you. Thank you for what you've contributed today, and more important, thank you for what you've contributed through your scholarship over a very long period of time now. I think that you have done a beautiful job of articulating why Bosnian studies exists and why it's necessary for it to continue. And for that, I'm very grateful. I look forward to talking with you all more in the future. This field is really field that depends very much on the contributions of many people. And I think the four of you are foremost among them. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
You, Ben.